The quiet clink of my teacup echoed as I said, "It's stage 4." Still, my daughter-in-law laughed, and my son just sat there, staring at the table, silent. As the warmth of the cup pressed into my hands, their silence froze everything else. While the spoon trembled against the porcelain, the distance between us became permanent. The same son I raised to protect me let his wife's cruelty hang in the air like smoke. That's when I knew, being a mother doesn't guarantee you'll be treated like one. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Joanne settled into the old wooden chair by the kitchen table, the one she always used when she wanted to feel grounded. The tea was still warm in her cup, its steam curling upward in gentle swirls, but her hands, pale and trembling just slightly, gripped the porcelain with a quiet strength. She had always been the calm in the storm, the steady anchor for everyone who needed her. But today she was the one in the storm. Mark and Amber sat across from her, a void between them that seemed to stretch longer than the table itself. Mark shifted uneasily in his chair, his fingers drumming an absent rhythm on the armrest, but his eyes never met hers. Amber, on the other hand, wasn't shy about her discomfort. She leaned back with an air of practiced indifference, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Joanne's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "I've been diagnosed with cancer. It's advanced. I need your support." The words hit the table between them, but neither Mark nor Amber seemed to fully absorb them. Amber's laugh cut through the tension before Joanne could even finish her sentence. "Oh, come on, cancer, really?" Amber snickered, the sound brittle and dismissive. "Probably just for attention. You've been needing that for a while, haven't you?" Joanne's heart skipped a beat. The words hit like a slap, but her face remained unreadable. She stared at her tea, not trusting herself to say anything more. She could feel the warmth of the liquid against her fingers, but it did nothing to calm the cold knot twisting in her stomach. Mark shifted again, his gaze dropping to the table, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Not a word, not even an apology. He just let it hang there like he always did when the air grew too thick with discomfort. Joanne wanted to scream at him. She wanted to shake him, demand that he say something, anything. But instead, she drank her tea. She kept her head high, even as her heart cracked just a little bit more. Lily appeared in the doorway, her small form framed by the soft afternoon light, her face full of quiet concern. Without a word, she walked over to Joanne's side and, with the gentleness only a child could possess, wrapped her arms around her grandmother. "I'm sorry, Grandma," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible as she nestled her face against Joanne's side. "I didn't know they'd be like this." Joanne's throat tightened. She wanted to pull Lily into her lap, to hold her close and shield her from all the cruelty and indifference that had crept into her family. But instead, she stayed still, letting the weight of the child's embrace anchor her to the moment. "It's all right, sweetheart," Joanne whispered, her voice shaky but resolute. "It's not your fault." Amber's laugh still lingered in the air, a sharp and hollow sound that didn't fit with the tenderness of the room. Joanne took a long breath, closing her eyes for a brief second as the wave of emotion threatened to pull her under. It wasn't just the cancer, it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the years of subtle dismissals, the quiet disregard. The way Mark always looked the other way when Amber's cruelty became too apparent. The way Amber used her silence as a weapon, cutting her down with a smile and a laugh, and no one ever questioned it. Her thoughts drifted to the years of giving, of always putting family first. She'd given everything, her love, her time, her effort, and in return this was how they treated her, like she didn't matter, like the bonds they shared were only as real as their convenience. As Lily pulled away, looking up at her with wide, earnest eyes, Joanne realized something in that moment. She'd never felt so alone in her life. And yet there was a flicker of something else, something sharper, something stronger. The pieces of her past had already begun to break apart, but a new kind of clarity was rising in its place. "I've logged it," she thought, her mind ticking over the moment like she was taking inventory of her own soul. "Every word, every look, every laugh, I won't forget." Mark cleared his throat, finally meeting her gaze. Are you sure about this diagnosis? You've had a lot of tests, right?" he asked, voice strained but still distant. Joanne set her cup down slowly, her eyes meeting his without a hint of anger, but with something he wasn't used to, something foreign, something final. "You should have asked that before the laughter, Mark," she said quietly, her tone so calm it was almost chilling. Amber sat up straighter, but the words felt like nothing now. empty and useless in the wake of what she'd just done. Joanne gave them both one last glance, her expression unreadable, before turning her gaze to Lily, who was still standing by her side, silently offering her the kind of support her own son and daughter-in-law couldn't muster. Lily smiled, that quiet, hopeful smile that reminded Joanne of everything worth fighting for. And as the realization struck her she was alone in this fight, Joanne made a silent promise. No matter what came next, she would fight, and she would not forget. Joanne stared at the glowing screen of her phone, the words from Mark's weekly family dinner invitation blinking back at her. It was like an old habit, an old tradition that no longer held the same warmth. Sunday dinners had been a constant, but now the thought of sitting at that table with Amber and Mark, of pretending things were normal, was unbearable. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain for a moment. She wasn't used to making decisions like this. She had always been the one to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to make it all work, but not anymore. With a long, steady breath, she typed the words, "Sunday dinners are cancelled indefinitely. I need time." There, it was done, the message sent, a clean break, but the weight of it settled on her chest. She stared at the phone, wondering if she'd done the right thing. There was a pang of sadness in her stomach, but it was drowned out by a sense of quiet relief. The tradition, the obligation, the empty smiles, she was done with it all. Her fingers tapped the next line in her mental checklist, medical appointments. She had to keep moving, keep organizing. She pulled up the calendar and began scheduling her chemotherapy sessions, the sterile names of doctors and treatments filling the spaces where family plans used to go. Her hands shook as she typed, but it wasn't from fear, it was from something else. A sense of autonomy, a flicker of independence. Joanne picked up her phone again, swiping through the contacts list. She found Mark and Amber's names, her thumb pausing over them. She had been their emergency contact for years, always the reliable one. But now, no more. She deleted both of them from the list, the action swift and final. She wasn't waiting for their support anymore. They had made it clear they weren't interested. The silence in the house felt heavier now, each corner of the room a reminder of what was lost. She wasn't angry, not anymore, but there was something deep inside her, something that felt like a seed growing. She was tired of being the one to give, the one to forgive. Now she was making space for herself. A ping interrupted her thoughts. It was a message from Lily. "Can I still see you?" Joanne smiled softly, her heart pulling tight at the simplicity of the question. It was just a small thing, but it felt like the lifeline she needed. She typed back quickly, "Always." Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of the words heavy in her chest. Always, she wasn't alone, not really. With a sigh, she set the phone down, then reached for her journal. The pen felt heavier than usual as she scrawled the words. "They laughed, I logged it." A quiet statement of truth, of a moment she would never forget. Joanne closed the journal, her heart beating a little faster now. The chemo was coming, the fight was coming. She would face it, not with bitterness but with a quiet resolve. She had already been through the worst, hadn't she? The laughter, the indifference, the betrayal. But the thing was, she had outlasted it all, and she would outlast this too. The first round of chemotherapy loomed ahead, but Joanne wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid anymore. She knew who she was now. She wasn't the woman who had put everyone else's needs first. She was the woman who would fight for herself, for Lily, for the future she deserved. And as she stood up and walked toward the door, a thought struck her. The empty dinners, the cold silences, they didn't define her. She was more than that. She was finally free. The phone felt heavy in Joanne's hand, its smooth surface cold against her skin. She wasn't used to making calls like this, calls that didn't revolve around family, around obligations, around the things she'd always done for others. But this was different. This was something she had to do for herself. She dialed Gina Holt's number, her estate attorney, the one person who had always been practical, grounded. Gina answered quickly, her voice smooth, professional. "Joanne, how are you?" Gina asked, a touch of warmth in her tone. Joanne paused for a moment, staring at the quiet of her house, the stillness that had settled in. "Since she made the choice to pull away, I need to make some changes," she said, her voice steady but final. "It's time to rewrite my will." There was a brief silence on the other end, the sound of papers rustling before Gina responded. "Of course, let's go over what you need." Joanne exhaled, steadying herself. She had been thinking about this for days, ever since that awful moment with Mark and Amber. She didn't want to leave anything to chance anymore. She didn't want them to have any claim over her life, her legacy, her peace. "I'm removing Mark and Amber from my inheritance," she said, her words clear. "They're not part of this anymore." Gina's voice softened, a hint of understanding in her tone. "Understood, I'll make sure that's noted. Anything else?" Joanne didn't hesitate. "I'm revoking Mark's power of attorney. He's no longer in charge. I want Natalie to take over." There was a pause before Gina replied. "Natalie, as in your friend Natalie?" "Yes, she's the only one I trust now. She's been there for me in ways no one else has." "All right," Gina said, "we'll get that sorted." Joanne looked around the room, her gaze resting on the family heirlooms scattered around her house, precious mementos from her past. Things she had once imagined passing down, sharing with her children, with her grandchildren. But now they felt like weight, symbols of everything that had gone wrong, everything that had been taken for granted. "I'm donating the heirlooms," Joanne continued, her voice firmer now, "to women's shelters. They'll go to people who need them more than Mark or Amber ever did." "Done, I'll add that to the documents. Anything else you'd like to add?" Joanne paused, the weight of it all settling on her shoulders. She had to say this. She had to make it real. She grabbed her pen and scrawled the line in her journal, the words sharp and deliberate, removed due to cruelty during crisis. Her chest tightened as she spoke the words aloud. "I want a line in my will, something simple, something that says why they're gone." Gina was quiet for a moment, then agreed. "It's important to have that clarity. We'll make it clear." Joanne closed her eyes, her mind focused. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about taking back control, about standing up for herself in a way she never had before. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was just done. When the call ended, Joanne sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the decisions settling over her like a blanket. It felt like an end, but it also felt like a beginning. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but she knew she was no longer afraid. She gathered the papers Gina had sent over, each one a symbol of her independence. She started filling in the blanks, documenting everything, every decision, every change. It was almost mechanical the way she moved through it, but it was necessary, it was hers, and this time she wasn't going to leave anything to chance. As she set down the pen, she looked out the window, her gaze following the path that curved through the yard. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the quiet street. In the stillness, Joanne realized something. She wasn't just rewriting her will, she was rewriting her life. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet moment. She glanced at the screen and her heart skipped a beat. It was from Lily. "Grandma, I made something for you. Can I bring it over tomorrow?" Joanne's fingers hovered over the screen as a wave of emotion washed over her. She smiled softly, the kind of smile she hadn't worn in weeks. "Of course, I can't wait to see it." Her heart swelled as she typed the message, and for the first time in a long while, the weight on her chest seemed to lighten. Joanne sat in the back of the church, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the quiet hum of conversation swirling around her. The cancer support group had gathered in the familiar room, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, each with their own story. But for now, it was just her quiet heart, and the weight of the world she'd been carrying for so long. The circle formed, and she took a seat, not knowing what to expect. She wasn't used to sharing her pain, not in this way, not like this. When her turn came, Joanne stood, her voice steady but soft. "I'm Joanne," she began, feeling the weight of the words as they passed her lips. "I've been diagnosed with cancer. It's been hard, of course, but what's harder is the way my family responded to it." She paused, taking in the room around her, the eyes that met hers, understanding but unspoken. "My son Mark and his wife Amber, they didn't handle it well. Amber laughed when I told her, called it attention-seeking. My son, he didn't say anything." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, and the group was quiet. Joanne didn't look for pity, didn't need their sympathy. But the silence from the group told her they understood in ways that only those who had been betrayed cowl. A woman in the circle, an older woman with silver curls, wiped a tear from her eye. She spoke softly but firmly, "That's not family, that's ego." Joanne's chest tightened at the words, but she nodded. "Exactly," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's not about love or care, it's about their own comfort, their own needs. I was just an inconvenience." The woman's words had struck a chord deep within Joanne, a truth she'd buried for so long. The anger had dissipated in her, but the hurt, the emptiness, remained. Still, there was something freeing about saying it out loud to people who didn't look at her with judgment. When the group session ended, Joanne walked outside with Natalie, her longtime friend who had been by her side throughout the treatment. The evening air was cool, the quiet of the night settling around them. Natalie walked beside her, the unspoken understanding between them more than enough. Joanne reached into her bag and pulled out the folder she'd been working on, the "If Anything Happens" folder for Lily. "I've been organizing everything for her," she said softly. "I want to make sure she has what she needs if anything happens." Natalie nodded, squeezing her shoulder in support. "You're doing the right thing, she deserves that, especially now." Joanne's gaze lingered on the folder in her hands. Her chest tightened at the thought of what it all meant, of what she might leave behind, but also what she could protect. Lily had always been the one bright spot in her life, and she would fight to make sure she had a future untouched by the selfishness of her family. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the familiar name flashing on the screen. Mark. Joanne felt her stomach tighten as she read the message. "You've been distant. Amber says she's hurt." Her thumb hovered over the screen, feeling the weight of the words she would send. The guilt, the old patterns threatened to rise, but she swallowed them down. She wasn't playing their game anymore. Her fingers typed slowly but decisively, "Tell her I'm alive, not interested in her funeral." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. For the first time, the response felt like freedom. She wasn't going to pretend anymore. She wasn't going to apologize for choosing herself. She slipped the phone back into her bag and looked up at Natalie, who gave her a small smile. No words were needed. Joanne felt lighter than she had in months, the weight of her family's indifference still heavy, but no longer something she had to carry. She had spoken the truth. She had taken the first step toward rebuilding her life, and this time it was for her. As the evening sky stretched above them, Joanne knew something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, she could see a path ahead, a path that was hers alone. Joanne sat at the dining room table, the papers spread out in front of her like a map of the future. She wasn't sure what to call it yet, this new chapter, this new path, but she knew it was hers. No longer shaped by the expectations of her family, no longer bound by the silences and the cruelty. This was hers to write, and she was determined to make it count. The ink from her pen blurred slightly as she signed the final document, the last of the amendments to her will. It felt like a release, the act of severing ties with Mark and Amber. She looked down at the page one last time before sliding it across to Gina Holt, the estate attorney who had become her ally in this quiet rebellion. Gina looked over the documents, her expression professional but warm. "It's done," she said simply, her voice calm as though the enormity of it had already settled in. "Mark and Amber are officially removed from your inheritance." Joanne nodded, her chest tight but lighter than she'd felt in weeks. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming what they had taken from her, about making sure that when she was gone, she wasn't leaving behind anything that could hurt her. She thought about her husband gone too soon and the life they'd shared, the legacy they'd built together. It was time to make sure that legacy stood not just for their children, but for those who had a greater need for it. "I'm setting up a memorial scholarship in Tom's name," she said, her voice steady, "for young people who have lost someone they loved, but Mark and Amber, they're not included." Gina didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'll make sure that's clear in the documents." Joanne's fingers brushed over the family heirlooms on the table, silver frames, old china, a quilt her grandmother had sewn. Things she'd once imagined passing down, things that had lost their meaning in the wake of Amber's laughter and Mark's silence. "I'm donating them," Joanne continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "All of them to women's shelters, let them find a purpose." Gina scribbled down the details. "It will be taken care of." Joanne turned her gaze out the window, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the room. It was a good decision, a freeing one, but there was still more to be done. Her thoughts turned to Lily, the only family member she could trust, the one bright spot in her life. She made a promise to herself that Lily would be taken care of no matter what happened. "I want to set up a trust for Lily," Joanne said, her fingers tapping the papers in front of her. "It will be activated when she turns 21. She'll have it all, everything I can give her, and no one else will have access to it." Gina nodded again. I'll make sure it's set up exactly as you want. No one can contest it with the no contest clause. Joanne's fingers grazed over the last page, the one that would finalize everything. It was a small thing, a quiet act, but it felt monumental. The no contest clause would make sure Mark and Amber couldn't challenge her decisions once she was gone. No one would have the power to undo what she had carefully planned, the life she was leaving behind, the future she was building for Lily. When the papers were all signed, Gina gathered them neatly, setting them aside for safekeeping. Everything is in place, she said, her voice reassuring. You've done well, Joanne. Joanne leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It's not about doing well, she said quietly. It's about finally doing what's right. As the weight of the decisions began to settle, Natalie arrived, as always, with a warm smile and a knowing look. She was carrying a camera, a small but important piece of Joanne's dignity archive. Together, they spent the next hour photographing the documents, proof of the decisions she had made, proof of the life she was creating for herself, for Lily. The light in the room softened as the sun dipped lower, and Joanne felt a strange sense of peace, not unlike the calm before a storm. She had been through so much, but now she was standing on solid ground. When the photos were taken and the documents safely stored, Natalie set the camera down and smiled at her. You're doing it, she said simply, her voice filled with pride. Joanne stood up, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. Hope. I am, she whispered. For the first time, I really am. As she closed the door behind Gina and Natalie, she turned back to the table, her fingers lightly resting on the papers in front of her. Everything had been accounted for, every detail considered. She had written her legacy, no one else. And in doing so, she had finally written herself into a future that was hers, completely and unequivocally. But as she glanced down at her phone, the message from Mark flashed on the screen. When you're ready, we can talk, I'm sorry. The words hung there like a challenge, but Joanne didn't flinch. She didn't need their apology anymore. She was done with apologies. The knock on the door was sharper than she expected, a sound that cut through the stillness of the afternoon. Joanne hesitated, standing still for a moment, knowing exactly who it was. There was no mistaking it. She hadn't been expecting them, not today, not after everything that had happened. But there they were. She opened the door and there stood Amber, holding a large container of lasagna, the edges wrapped in foil, and Mark standing beside her, looking sheepish, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. We brought dinner, Amber said, her voice high-pitched and too cheerful. We thought maybe we could, make things right. Joanne looked at the food, then up at Amber's face. She could see the effort in Amber's smile, the rehearsed kindness, the hope that this act might undo everything. But nothing could erase the words Amber had spoken, nothing could wash away the cruelty. She didn't invite them in right away, but stepped aside with a small, tight nod. Come in, Joanne said, her tone neutral, showing no warmth, no welcome, just a simple invitation to move forward with whatever it was they wanted. As they walked past her into the quiet of the house, Amber was the first to speak again, voice forced, eager. We just want to make up, start over, we miss having you around. She placed the lasagna down on the counter with a flourish, like it was supposed to mean something more than it did. Joanne stood still, watching them both. Mark avoided her eyes, his body language stiff and awkward. I thought it might be a good start, he muttered, but he didn't offer more. Joanne said nothing. She walked over to the table, setting the placemats in place, but her eyes never left them. She wasn't going to make this easy for them. She wasn't going to pretend that this was just about a dinner. She wasn't about to accept their half-hearted attempts at fixing everything they had broken. Amber stood there waiting for a response, and after a long pause she said, it's not too late, right? You could at least give us a chance. We're family, Joanne. The words cut into her, the irony sharp. Amy Lee, the people who were supposed to care about her, to stand by her, hadn't been there, not when it mattered. Joanne turned, her gaze finally meeting Amber's, her voice calm but cold. You've already sat down, she said simply, the words hanging in the air between them. That day. Amber's smile faltered, but Joanne didn't give her the chance to respond. She moved toward the kitchen counter, picking up a knife, and began cutting the lasagna into portions. She wasn't hungry, she wasn't interested in playing this game. After a moment, Amber and Mark wordlessly followed her to the table, but neither of them reached for the food. Their discomfort filled the room, but Joanne wasn't going to break, not now. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, Amber asked, "Aren't you going to sit down?" Joanne didn't respond. She simply picked up the plate, walked over to the trash can, and scraped the lasagna off the plate with a deliberate motion. The sound of it hitting the garbage was final. As the door clicked shut behind them, Joanne felt an odd, detached peace settle over her. She wasn't angry, she wasn't sad, she was just done. She had given enough of herself to them. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, Lily's name on the screen. "Grandma, they're acting like nothing happened." Joanne's heart tightened, but she didn't need to explain herself anymore. She typed back quickly, her fingers tapping decisively across the screen, "They don't get to act like nothing happened, and neither do I." She hit send, leaned back against the counter, and let the words sit there for a moment. She was done pretending, done trying to make things right with people who didn't deserve it. Joanne closed her eyes for a brief second, the weight of the decision settling in. She was finally free. Joanne sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of her printer the only sound in the room. The social media post from Amber sat before her on the screen, its carefully curated words glaring up at her. Amber had posted it just hours ago, a thinly veiled attempt to rewrite the family narrative. The caption was dripping with forced sincerity. "Family is everything. Even when it's hard, we stand together. Blessed family first." Joanne's fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, a mix of disbelief and contempt swirling inside her. The timestamp was glaring, fresh. She clicked print, the sound of the paper sliding out of the machine almost too satisfying. She placed the printed post into a folder labeled Evidence, her movements deliberate, as if marking a chapter of her life she was now done with. The post wasn't about love, it was about appearances. It was about making sure the world saw them as the caring, unified family they were. Joanne's fingers hovered over her laptop as the idea for her next move formed. It wasn't enough to simply be angry, she needed to write, she needed to take back the narrative. The blog was born almost immediately. She titled it Between Chemo and Clarity. It felt right, raw, real. It was a space for her to speak without filters, without the need for approval or apology. She wouldn't name names, wouldn't make it about revenge, but the truth would be there in every post. The truth of what it felt like to be treated like an afterthought by the people she should have been able to trust the most. The first post went up, raw and personal, the words tumbling from her like a river unleashed. She spoke of her cancer, but also of the emotional toll of betrayal, how it had shaped every moment of this journey. She didn't name Amber or Mark, but the feelings were clear, the hurt undeniable. The blog took off quicker than she expected. Small comments trickled in at first. Other cancer survivors, people who understood the sting of abandonment, left words of support. "You're not alone. Thank you for sharing this." A sense of power washed over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't hiding. She was standing tall, sharing her truth in a way she never had before. Then Amber found it. Joanne's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Amber. "You're really doing this?" Amber's words were sharp, dripping with indignation. "This blog, it could ruin my reputation. People are talking." Joanne's lip curled into a small smile as she read the message. Amber's concern wasn't for the truth, it was for her image. The message wasn't a surprise, Joanne had expected it in some form. She could almost hear Amber's voice dripping with that same rehearsed sweetness. Joanne's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed her response. "If the shoe fits, take it off." The message was simple, final, and as cutting as she intended. She hit send, her chest not heavy but clear. She was done. The next morning, Gina arrived, sitting across from Joanne as they worked through the next step. She helped Joanne copyright select entries from the blog, ensuring that no one, especially not Amber, could ever use the words against her. Joanne watched the words take shape, their power becoming more concrete with every step. When it was done, she sat back in her chair and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but this was hers now, her story, her truth, her voice. Her phone buzzed again, another comment on the blog. She glanced at it and a small smile tugged at her lips. "You've given me strength, thank you." For the first time in a long while, Joanne didn't feel alone. Joanne stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest as she adjusted the microphone. The event had been billed as a celebration of cancer survivors, a gathering of strength, and for once she felt like she belonged. The spotlight hit her when it was her turn to speak, and she took a steadying breath, looking out over the crowd. Faces filled with empathy, people who had walked similar roads, who knew the weight of the illness and the burden of feeling unseen. "I've been through a lot," she began, her voice steady but soft. "But the hardest part hasn't been the cancer. The hardest part has been learning that the people you thought would be there for you when it matters the most often are." Her gaze swept across the audience, meeting the eyes of those who understood. The truth of what she had been through poured out of her as she continued, unburdened for the first time. "I didn't come here to talk about treatment plans or hospital visits. I came to talk about something far more important, how we show up for each other when it counts." There was a brief pause as the words settled. Joanne knew this was the moment to say it, to reclaim her voice in front of strangers, in front of people who didn't judge, people who understood. "I thought my family would be there for me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But instead of love, I got silence, I got a laugh, I got empty words." Joanne took a breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just talking about cancer. She was talking about betrayal, the feeling of being invisible when she needed her son and daughter-in-law the most. She could feel the heat in her chest, but it wasn't anger anymore, it was clarity. "And you know what?" she said, her eyes now fixed on the crowd. "Some people walk the journey, others take selfies." The room was quiet for a moment, and then there was the sound of slow clapping. Joanne felt the warmth spread through her as the applause grew. It wasn't about the applause, it was about this moment, this shift in her life. Natalie, who had been recording her speech from the side, gave her a quiet thumbs up as Joanne finished. She felt lighter, more herself than she had in years. Later that evening, as she checked her phone, Joanne saw Amber's latest social media post. More pictures, more family moments that screamed perfection, that screamed a version of reality Joanne knew all too well wasn't true. The irony wasn't lost on her. Amber was still playing the part, she was still pretending. Joanne smirked, her fingers already typing. She posted a new entry to her blog, more pointed than before. "Some people post pictures, some people live the reality behind them." The post began to gain traction immediately, comments pouring in from strangers, cancer survivors, people who saw through the act. She felt empowered, her words connecting with so many others who had experienced similar betrayal, similar abandonment. The next day, a local paper reached out. They wanted to do a feature on her blog, on her journey. Her words, her truth were being heard. Joanne felt a quiet sense of victory. She wasn't waiting for Amber or Mark's approval anymore. This was her life, her story, and no one could take that from her. Gina called later that afternoon. "The legal work is finalized, your will, Lily's trust, everything's set, no one can challenge it." Joanne felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. It was done, she had control. Just as she set her phone down, a new message from Mark popped up. "Can we talk? I'm sorry for everything." Joanne stared at the screen, her heart beating a little faster. Her thumb hovered over the message. She had already made her decision. She typed quickly, "It's too late." Her finger hovered for a moment longer before hitting send. And for the first time, Joanne felt truly free. The bell rang loud and clear, its sharp tone echoing through the treatment center. Joanne's hand lingered on the cool metal for just a moment longer, taking in the finality of the sound. This was it, the end of her chemotherapy journey. The sound of the bell wasn't just a symbol, it was a mark of survival, a reminder that despite everything, she had made it. But as the noise faded, a familiar emptiness settled in. There were no familiar faces in the room, no Mark, no Amber. The silence in the treatment center felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of everything unspoken. She had done this alone, as she had so many times before. Joanne stepped away from the bell, her chest tight, not from the cancer but from the absence. It was always this way. When it mattered most, they hadn't been there. She walked toward the exit, the weight of the empty chair beside her at the bell-ringing ceremony sitting heavily on her shoulders. No flowers, no congratulations, just her, standing at the end of the hardest chapter of her life. Outside, Joanne pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the crisp air. Her phone buzzed in her bag and she pulled it out, her heart tightening when she saw the message. It was from Lily. "Grandma, I made something for you. I'm so proud of you. You beat it, but you were always stronger than it." Joanne's fingers trembled slightly as she read the words, her eyes brimming with tears. She wiped them away quickly, a smile tugging at her lips. She typed back, "You are my strength, sweetheart, always." For a moment, Joanne felt the weight of everything she had endured lift. Lily's love was the only thing that had never faltered. It was enough. Back home, Joanne sat at her desk, the finality of her remission settling in. She opened the folder where she kept her will and estate documents. She added the final clause she had been meaning to include: "Do not notify Amber or Mark in the event of death." There was no anger in it, just a simple, quiet decision to protect herself, to protect Lily, to make sure that when it came time, no one would disrupt her peace. Later that evening, Gina arrived, bringing with her a bottle of wine and a small smile. "To survival," Gina said, raising her glass in silence. Joanne clinked her glass against Gina's, the sound of the crystal breaking the stillness. "To the truth," she replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each sip of wine a quiet celebration. Joanne felt at peace, the years of tension and hurt finally unraveling. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and she was no longer afraid of what others thought. After Gina left, Joanne sat back at her desk, feeling the weight of the moment. Her fingers moved quickly as she typed the next post for her blog. The words flowed easily now, each line more confident than the last. She wasn't hiding anymore. The truth of her journey, of her survival, had a place now. She saved the draft and opened a new file. It was time. She titled it Chemo and Clarity and began the first chapter. She wasn't sure where this would go or what would come of it, but for the first time it didn't matter. This was her story, and she was finally ready to share it. Joanne sat back, her fingers resting on the keyboard as she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The book had begun. Joanne sat at her desk, her hands cold as she opened the email from Gina. The subject was blunt: cease and desist from Amber. Joanne clicked it open, already bracing herself. Amber's words spilled out on the screen, a blend of legal jargon and righteous indignation. She claimed that Joanne's blog was defamation, that it threatened her reputation, and demanded the removal of all posts related to her. Joanne didn't flinch. She had expected this. Amber was always more concerned about her image than the truth. She clicked away from the email and immediately typed a quick response to Gina: "Handle it, no removal, not backing down." Gina's reply was swift: "Got it. I'll send a response and make it clear that she has no grounds to stand on." Joanne sat back in her chair, the weight of the letter sinking in. Amber had no real claim, she never did, but the audacity of trying to silence Joanne, of trying to control her narrative once again, it stung. Later, Gina called. "The letter is sent," she confirmed, her voice calm and measured. "I've made it clear that Amber's claims are baseless and we've documented everything. They won't win this one." Joanne let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thanks, Gina," she said softly. "It's done." The next morning, Joanne sat at her desk again. She opened her blog and typed the post that had been brewing inside her. With Gina's permission, she uploaded the cease and desist letter alongside her own commentary. She made it clear she wasn't hiding and she wasn't backing down. The truth would be seen. Almost immediately, comments flooded in. Readers rallied behind Joanne, offering words of support. Many were cancer survivors, some were people who had faced similar betrayals from their families. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to speak my truth. You're not alone, I'm right here with you." Joanne felt a quiet strength grow inside her. These words were real, this was real. Her inbox was flooded with messages of support, but it was the letters that moved her the most. She opened one from a woman named Claire, another cancer survivor who had written about her own struggles with family abandonment. "You gave me the courage to stop hiding," the letter began. "Thank you for giving me permission to stand up for myself even when it's hard." Joanne folded the letter slowly, her heart swelling. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, needed to know that her voice mattered, that her struggle wasn't just hers to bear. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Lily standing there, a homemade card in her hands. Joanne smiled, a wave of emotion rushing through her. "Grandma," Lily said, holding out the card, "I made this for you." Joanne took the card and read the simple words, "You're my real home." Her throat tightened, and for the first time in weeks, tears welled in her eyes. Lily stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Joanne. "You've always been my hero," she whispered. Joanne squeezed her tight, feeling the weight of the years of struggle, of silence, begin to slip away. For the first time in a long while, she let herself cry, not from pain but from the quiet relief of knowing that she wasn't alone anymore. "I love you, sweet girl," Joanne said, her voice shaky but full of truth. "You're everything to me." Lily smiled, pulling away slightly to look up at her. "You're strong, Grandma, you always have been." Joanne smiled through her tears, her heart full. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and she was no longer afraid to speak her truth. Her phone buzzed with another comment on her blog, and for the first time, Joanne didn't hesitate to look. This time, she didn't need to reply. Her words were already out there, they would be heard, and that was enough. Joanne sat across from Gina, papers spread before her, finalizing the details of her legacy plan. The will, trust, and estate were all in order now, every scholarship, every bequest carefully thought through. It was a plan of survival, not just for herself but for Lily, for the future. The weight of years of silent sacrifice was being replaced with clarity and control. "The no contest clause is locked in," Gina said, checking over the documents one last time. "The scholarships, the trust for Lily, everything is set, it's bulletproof." Joanne took a steadying breath as she signed the final page. For the first time in a long while, she felt something like peace. Amber and Mark had lost their place in her life, but Lily, her granddaughter, the one person who truly understood, would carry on. Joanne was ready to walk away from the past. Later that evening, Joanne scrolled through Amber's latest social media posts. Photos of Amber with staged smiles, captions filled with hollow phrases about family strength and getting through the tough times. It all felt so fake, like she was still trying to control the Narati. Joanne couldn't help but smirk. It wasn't working anymore, the mask was slipping. Her phone buzzed with a new email from Mark. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. "Mom," the email began, "I'm sorry for everything. I've been thinking about what I did. I was wrong and I want to make it right. I hope we can talk soon." Joanne felt a small pang in her chest but didn't let it linger. She knew what she needed to do. She clicked open the legal document she had prepared and attached it to the email, the PDF titled Full Legal Disinheritance. Her fingers moved over the keys, a calm certainty in her words. "I appreciate your apology, Mark, but the decision is final. Please see the attached document." She hit send without looking back. The decision was made. The next day, Joanne received unexpected news. Lily had been offered early admission to a prestigious arts program. The letter arrived with her usual bright smile, holding it in front of Joanne. "I got in, Grandma. I'm going to be a part of something big." Lily's excitement was contagious. Joanne read the letter, her heart swelling with pride. The scholarship Joanne had set up would cover everything: tuition, books, supplies. Lily's future was set. "You're going to do amazing things, sweetheart," Joanne whispered, her voice full of emotion. "This is your time." Later that day, Joanne opened her laptop, feeling a sense of completion. She published her memoir, Chemo and Clarity. It was more than just her story now, it was a symbol of strength, of reclaiming her life, her voice. The book quickly sold out in its first week, with the second print run already underway. Joanne sat back looking at the screen. Her words were now part of something bigger, something that mattered. She wasn't just a survivor, she was an inspiration. For the first time in years, Joanne felt fully at peace. Her legacy was no longer tied to the disappointments of the past, but to the love and hope she had built for Lily and the truth that had set her free. The knock on the door was soft but unmistakable. Joanne sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in front of her, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the ceramic. She had been expecting this visit. She had known it was coming. Mark had reached out once again, and though she wasn't surprised, there was a calmness in her now that she hadn't had before. She had let go. She had already made peace with her decisions. She opened the door slowly, her eyes meeting her son's for the first time in weeks. Mark stood there, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets, his face a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. He had never looked so small before. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "can we talk?" Joanne stepped aside, her gaze cool but not unkind. "Come in." Mark shuffled inside, glancing around as if he were unsure where to place his feet, as if this home was no longer his. Joanne closed the door behind him, the quiet of the house suddenly too heavy. The silence stretched out between them. She didn't offer him a seat. Instead, she remained standing, her back straight, her posture a silent statement that this conversation would unfold on her terms. "I've been thinking a lot," Mark began, his voice cracking slightly, "about everything, the way I treated you, the way I handled things with Amber, with the family, and I know I was wrong." Joanne didn't speak immediately. She let him continue, her gaze fixed on him but her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. "I want to make things right," Mark continued, his voice pleading now. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try, Mom, please. I know I've hurt you and I just want a chance to fix it." Joanne felt the weight of his words, but something inside her shifted. She wasn't angry anymore, she wasn't even disappointed. She had already let go of those feelings. What he was saying now, what he was offering, didn't carry the same weight it once had. "You said everything," Joanne replied, her voice steady but without warmth, just not with words. Mark froze, his eyes searching her face, looking for some sign of softness, some crack in the armor. He didn't find it. I didn't understand," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I was just lost. I didn't know how to handle it, how to be there for you." Joanne looked at him then, her gaze sharper than before. "You didn't have to handle it, Mark. You didn't have to figure it out. All you had to do was be there, speak up when it mattered, not when it was easy." She paused, her voice a quiet strength that carried no anger but a deep, unyielding finality. "But you didn't, and that's something I'll never forget." Mark opened his mouth to say something, but Joanne raised a hand, silencing him. "No, there's nothing you can do now." He closed his mouth, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words were settling over him. He had come to make amends, to find a way back into her life, but what he didn't understand, what he hadn't yet grasped, was that the door had already closed. Joanne's expression softened just slightly, but there was no returning from this. "Except remember this, Mark," she said, her voice low but firm. "Next time someone laughs when you should speak, remember this moment. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to do better next time." Mark stood there for a long moment, staring at her. It wasn't anger that twisted in his gut, but shame. The reality of what he had lost settled in with a finality he hadn't expected. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even resentful, he was just smaller, defeated by his own actions. "I understand," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. He turned to leave without another word, his steps slow and heavy. Joanne didn't watch him go. She didn't need to, she had already let him walk away. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in a long while Joanne let herself breathe. It wasn't relief, it wasn't victory, it was something quieter, deeper. She had closed a chapter finally, fully, no more waiting, no more hoping, just the peace of knowing that she was in control of her own story. As the silence enveloped her once more, Joanne sat back down at the kitchen table. The world outside was waiting, but for now she allowed herself this moment. The conversation was over, the past was behind her. And with that, Joanne could finally move forward. Joanne sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting lightly on the will and estate documents. Everything was finalized. The scholarships, the trust for Lily, the legacy she would leave behind, everything was now in her control. She looked down at the signature line one last time, making sure the no contest clause was in place. This was her final act of liberation, ensuring that her story and the future she'd fought for would be protected. Later, she opened a new document on her computer. She had made another decision, one that had been coming for some time. She began to write her obituary, a brief, simple statement of the life she had lived. There was only one person she wanted to name at the end: Lily Tucker, granddaughter, only family. The words felt right. Her life had been defined by many things: family, sacrifice, love. But now there was only one person who remained, one person who had stood by her. The obituary was followed by another decision, one she had known was necessary but hadn't fully realized how much it would mean. Joanne established a writing grant for women healing from family estrangement. She wanted to give others the tools to reclaim their stories, to help those who had faced the same betrayals she had. The grant would fund their journey back to themselves, helping them find their voice just as Joanne had. The weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and change. Joanne moved into a smaller, sunnier home on the edge of town, a fresh start. The new place was quiet, with large windows that let the sunlight pour in. It was everything her old home hadn't been: a space for healing, a sanctuary from the past. One afternoon, Joanne sat at her new kitchen table writing a letter to Lily. She felt a deep ache in her chest as she wrote, but also a quiet peace. "Sweetheart," she wrote, "you broke the cycle. You gave me the strength to see beyond the pain. Everything I've done, I did for you. You'll never truly know how much you've saved me." She sealed the letter, feeling the weight of it settle in her soul. Lily was the future. Lily was the only family that mattered. A week later, Joanne received an invitation from Natalie, who was hosting a survivors' brunch. "Would you consider speaking?" Natalie asked, her tone kind. "I think your story would really help the others." Joanne hadn't spoken at such an event before, but something inside her knew it was time. She agreed. At the brunch, she stood before a room full of women, survivors of their own battles, whether with cancer, betrayal, or loss. As she spoke, her voice was calm, unshaken. She spoke about the power of reclaiming your story, of not letting others define your worth. She spoke of the pain of abandonment and how she had learned to let go. There was a quiet weeping in the room as women found the courage to release their own burdens. Joanne's words struck a chord. One woman, sitting in the back, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Joanne's heart tightened as she recognized the look in the woman's eyes, the same look she had once worn herself. After the event, the woman approached her, her voice full of emotion. "You gave me hope," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was alone, but now I know I'm not." Joanne gave her a small smile. "You're never alone," she said, her heart full. She had redefined her life not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever felt unseen, unheard. Joanne had written her own legacy, and for the first time, it was one she was proud of. Joanne stood at the entrance of the new cancer center, the soft hum of the building's quiet energy surrounding her. The floors gleamed with sunlight, and the walls, lined with soft colors and calming art, gave off an air of hope. It was a place where healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a space she had helped create. The tour guide, a young woman with a kind face, walked Joanne through the center, explaining the state-of-the-art facilities and the programs that would support survivors for years to come. Joanne had been a major donor, a driving force behind its creation. She had given more than just money. She had poured her heart into it, wanting to give other women the hope that she had fought so hard to find. As they walked down the hallway, they came to a small plaque near the entrance of one of the private consultation rooms. The tour guide paused and gestured toward it. Joanne's heart gave a quiet thud as she read the inscription. It was simple, understated, but it was everything she had worked for. "For the ones who survived spite." The words hit Joanne harder than she expected. She ran her fingers gently along the edge of the plaque. She hadn't done this for recognition, hadn't expected a name or a moment of acknowledgement. But to see it, to see her name etched alongside such powerful words, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time seen. The guide continued, but Joanne's mind lingered on the plaque, on what she had built and on what she had left behind. She had survived, and now she was giving others the tools to survive as well. Later that afternoon, Lily arrived at the house, her arms full of a thick portfolio. Her face was lit up with excitement, her eyes shining as she practically skipped toward Joanne. "Grandma, look, I finished a new collection." Lily's voice was filled with the kind of joy only a passionate artist could possess. Joanne's heart swelled. She couldn't help but beam with pride as Lily laid the portfolio open on the table. The art was bold, bright, full of emotion. It was clear Lily had found her voice, her canvas. Joanne ran her fingers lightly over the pages, admiring the intricate detail, the raw expression. "These are amazing, sweetheart," Joanne whispered, her eyes a little too bright. "You're going to change the world." Lily grinned, her cheeks flushed with the joy of the moment. "I just want to make you proud, Grandma." "You already do," Joanne replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You're everything I could have ever hoped for." Later that evening, Joanne sat at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of her home surrounding her as she wrote. Her pen moved quickly across the paper, her thoughts flowing with a sense of finality. "You are what I leave behind, not them." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. She had spent her life giving, forgiving, hoping for the people who never truly saw her. But now she knew that the legacy she would leave behind was not one of disappointment or betrayal. It was one of strength, of hope, and of love for Lily. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was Gina holding the final legacy binder, the last of the estate paperwork, the final document that would seal her decisions. Joanne welcomed her inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table, the binder between them. "Everything is in order," Gina said, looking up at Joanne with a smile. "You've done it, it's all set." Joanne nodded, her heart quiet but filled with a sense of completion. "It's done," she whispered, "and I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Gina raised her glass of wine in a quiet toast. "To the past," she said softly, "and to the future." Joanne clinked her glass gently against Gina's. As the sound echoed in the quiet room, Joanne couldn't help but smile. This was her new beginning, her new legacy, and it was everything she had fought for. As they sat together, the world outside fading into the quiet of the evening, Joanne knew she had left behind something far more precious than anything she had ever expected. A future, a real one. Joanne stood at the back of the crowded auditorium, watching Lily among the sea of new students at her college orientation. The air was thick with excitement, every student here starting a new chapter, eager for what the future might hold. Lily, standing a little apart from the others, held her portfolio tightly under one arm, her face alight with purpose. Joanne's heart swelled with pride. This was the moment Joanne had been waiting for, the moment when Lily, the only family that truly mattered now, stepped into her future. Joanne had poured everything into making sure this moment came to be, not just for herself but for Lily. The weight of years of sacrifice, of holding her family together at the expense of herself, seemed so distant now. The world had shifted, and she could finally see it clearly. Standing beside her, Natalie gave her a quiet smile. Joanne placed a hand on her friend's shoulder, a gesture that needed no explanation. Natalie had been there for her, not just during her treatment but through everything, through the hardest, most painful times. Together they had seen her through to this moment. The speaker continued, offering words of encouragement about the journey ahead, but it wasn't until he quoted one of Joanne's blog posts that she was truly brought back into the room. "Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal," the speaker said, "but your legacy begins with love." Joanne's breath caught in her chest as the words echoed in her ears. It wasn't the first time she had read or heard them, but in this context, among these strangers, these survivors, it felt different. The weight of everything she'd been through, every painful decision, the countless days of silence had led to this. A legacy not tied to blood but to the love she'd chosen, the love she had given. She had given it to Lily, and now it was the foundation of everything. The applause that followed brought Joanne back to the present. She glanced over at Lily, who had shifted her attention back to the stage, her face beaming with the kind of quiet determination Joanne had always known was in her. She was ready for this. After the ceremony, the three of them walked out into the cool evening, the sky turning soft shades of pink and gold. The air felt crisp, clean, as if it too was part of Joanne's fresh start. For the first time in a long while, there was no shadow of the past following her. There was just this, a new chapter, a chapter she had written herself. When they arrived home, the porch lights glowed softly in the dusk, casting a warm, inviting light over the house. Joanne stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The house was small, but it was hers, filled with the light she had fought for. It was the future she had built, her place in the world, her new life. Inside, the final legal binder waited for her on the kitchen table. She had made the necessary decisions, everything had been set in motion. She picked it up, feeling no regret. Everything was in its rightful place. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising softly, and sat down at the table. The world outside seemed far away. She opened her journal and began to write, the words flowing easily now. She paused for a moment, reading over what she'd written. There was no more weight to carry, no more unfinished business. She had made it. It was done, and the peace she had been searching for had finally settled in. The door was closed, the past was behind her, she was free.